The auctioneer's voice cracked like old paint flaking from a clapboard wall. Lot 57, abandoned farmhouse, county holds clear title. Opening bid, $300. No one moved. The October wind crossed the fairgrounds with a brittle hiss, rattling the flags, carrying the faint smell of kettle corn and diesel and the weary shrug of a crowd interested only in shiny tractors and parcels with promise. Arthur Williams stood a few steps back from the ring, his cane sunk a half-inch into the dust. The cane wasn't the cheap aluminum kind. It was hickory, burnished by his hand and engraved with his wife's initials, M.W. for Margaret, for the voice that had once told him to bet on long shots because hope, like thrift store china, could glow when the light hit it right. 300 wasn't rent money. It wasn't a safety net. It was his last, banded inside a white envelope he'd tucked against his ribs. Hospital bills had eaten the rest. Those lavish feasts of coded charges and co-pays that tasted like copper and aspirin. He didn't have future plans, just doctor's appointments and polite questions about support networks. He had a beat-up pickup that coughed before it started, a pension stretched thinner than a prayer, and a promise he'd made at a hospice bedside. "I'll go to the auctions for you, Mags. I'll bring back a good story." "Do I hear 300? The auctioneer called, impatience tightening his vowels. Arthur lifted his hand. It felt like hefting a rucksack again, kneecaps buzzing, back tightening into old knots. A few heads turned, some with the tolerant smile reserved for old men chasing ghosts and bargains. The clerk's pencil paused above her pad. "Bid of 300, the spotter said, as if he couldn't quite believe the number. Silence. Not respectful, not hostile, just the flat sound of the world not caring. The auctioneer tried for 350, then 325, then, with the sigh of a man counting beans, sold, 300 even. The receipt paper tore. The envelope went light. Arthur's mouth was dry as plaster. No one congratulated him. Why would they? He'd bought a ruin an hour north of town, a structure mulled over by the county assessment office, roof like a broken jaw, fields colonized by shoulder-high goldenrod, a farmhouse, only in memory and property records. He tucked the receipt into his wallet, touched his cane to his lips like it was a saint's relic, and walked slow to the parking lot. The road out was a thread across brown fields and black-limbed trees. Margaret used to narrate drives like a documentary, names of birds swooping the fence lines the way barns leaned into time like dancers into music. The cab was quiet now, just the rattle of tools and the soft blues on an AM station soft enough to have no audience. He kept glancing at the passenger seat, expecting her to be there, laughing at some detail he'd missed. The empty fabric stared back. When he reached the mailbox, a leaning soldier of rust stamped with a name he didn't know. The sky was the tired blue of old denim, the house hunched behind a tangle of sumac and briars, porch sagging, windows cataracted with grime. The garage sat to the right, detached, padlocked, the roof tar-papered in patches like a desperate quilt. A plastic tarp hung from one corner, flapping. "Home," Arthur said, because it was absurd, because the word stabbed and soothed. He cut the engine and let the cold quiet settle, the way a chapel falls still after the last hymn. He climbed out, sock catching inside his boot, cane testing the ground until the gravel told him it would hold. The front door was screwed shut with sheet metal like the county had tried to staple the past in place. He ran his palm along the siding and felt the raised heads of nails, the buckled warmth of sun-baked paint. He didn't feel excitement. He felt the steady, familiar hum of mission. Enter, assess, endure. The lock on the garage looked less ambitious, a hunk of rust and stubbornness. He took out the bolt cutters he'd bought at the pawn shop and fed them the loop of steel. His shoulder protested. The cut was a groan. The lock fell with the dignity of a small, defeated animal. He eased the door up. It stuck, then relented, rolling uneven on warped tracks, and the smell came first. A dense, breathy exhalation of old oil, damp wood, mice, and the metallic tang of neglect. Dust motes swarmed his face like the smallest of stars. Inside, shapes sat under tarps, the cloth stiff with grime, a row of hanging tools like teeth above a workbench. The floor was a mottled map of spills and footprints. He stepped in, cane knocking a bottle cap, heart ticking faster from effort and something else. An old, primitive surge, the sensation of entering the unknown and being the only witness to it. He pulled at the nearest tarp, and it peeled back with a sound like tearing bread. Beneath, the rounded fender of a car. Another tug, and an emblem winked through gray, chrome dulled by dust but still proud. Letters in a script he had seen on posters and films. Rumors of a time when machines were sculpture and swagger. He didn't cheer. He didn't even smile. He let the tarp slide off and the car took a breath under the light. It was a coupe, long and low, now a patient draped in ruin. Fenders freckled with rust, tires collapsed, chrome pitted, windshield fogged along the edges with a white scum like cataracts. He moved to the second tarp. The cane wobbled. He braced, pulled. Another car, older, with a grille like a cathedral gate. It looked asleep and guarded, the way an old lion sleeps. Body a map of scars, the head refusing to bow. And yet the sense that these were animals overcome by floodwater. The roof had leaked. Water had dripped for years, cutting dark canals down their flanks, filigreeing the concrete in tide marks. Everything wore the muted, indifferent uniform of rot. Arthur stood between the two shapes and felt his chest cinch. He had expected emptiness. A lawnmower carcass, a coffee can of bolts, a nest of snakes. This was worse and better. He said aloud, "Damn it, Margaret," hoping her name would steady him. She loved stories where the junk at the back of the shed turned out to be treasure. He had loved telling her they were nonsense. He had loved being wrong for her. He slid his palm along the coupe's roof. The dust came away in a clean streak revealing paint that was once midnight but now red as a rumor of blue. Underneath a gloss. Not dead. Not yet. He leaned against the fender and let the weight of the day push him down to the floor. He didn't cry. Not then. He exhaled a long, quiet breath that made a little gray storm in front of his lips, and he stared at the far wall, where an old calendar hung frozen on a June in a year before he went to war. Outside, a crow barked. The wind pushed in and lifted the edge of a tarp, exposing a headlight like a blind eye. Arthur forced himself up. He was tired past the bone, tired in that cellular way grief carves out, but he had done the thing he said he'd do. He'd bought the long shot. He closed the garage. The door rattled and caught, and he had to kick the track with his boot to coax it shut. He slid the dead lock back in place. The sun had dropped a hand's breadth. He stood there a minute, hands on the cool metal, and then he got in his truck and drove back to the rental he could not afford for much longer. He slept badly. Images shuffled in the dark. Margaret in a polka-dot dress under a VFW hall ceiling of paper lanterns. The flash of a roadside in a country that smelled like diesel and jasmine. The face of a man before it becomes a memory. At dawn, he put on the same jacket, poured coffee into the travel mug with the chipped handle, and drove back. The farmhouse let him in like a secret that had already decided his part. He had a broom, rags, a flashlight. He had time. He had nothing better than this. The second morning came on damp and gray, a sky the color of an old sink. Arthur parked in a rutted groove that might once have been a driveway, and listened to the flat song of wind skimming through the sumac. He told himself the job was simple. Clear a path, get the lay of the rooms, start with the obvious hazards. That was the language of field work. Sort, prioritize, make a map of what might kill you and what might save you. The front door was a study in resistance. The screws that pinned the sheet metal to the jamb had fused with paint and habit. He went to the side entrance instead, where a small porch sagged like a shrug. That door relented with less drama, and he stepped into a kitchen that smelled of mouse and mold and lemon cleanser dried to a ghost. The house had not been lived in so much as it had been paused. Dishes, dust-furred, sat by a sink half full of a mineral crust. A newspaper lay on the table, edges curled like bark. The headline spoke of a name he knew from history class and a scandal that had long since learned to limp. On the fridge, a magnet held a photograph of someone's children on a beach. He took nothing. He walked room to room like a medic checking pulses. Living room, a couch eaten by springs, a TV made when furniture had pride, hallway, framed certificates for dubious achievements, bedroom, a mattress slumped into a valley, a dresser with one drawer stuck open as if still deciding, bathroom, the superstitious shine of old tile under grime. He opened windows and heard the house exhale, a tired beast, grateful and stunned. Light changed everything. Where the wallpaper had sagged, it now patterned the air with a faded flock of roses. Where he had seen ruin in low light, he could see bones. Lines that made sense. The proportions of a place built with care before it was sentenced to its slow trial. He swept until sweat prickled the back of his neck, and the muscles above his hips ached with a familiar heat. He found a mouse nest inside the stovepipe, a cracked jar of marbles, a child's crayon drawing of a red airplane with a smile. The garage waited. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he was a practical man again, a triage artist. He told himself many things, and then he went to the garage anyway, because he had never learned how to stay away from the thing that scared him. He slid up the door, and the same smell welcomed him, with a new edge. A sharpness of warmed dust and old oil stirred. He pulled at the tarp covering the coupe's hood and folded it to the windshield. Dust made shadows across his knuckles. With the rag, he wiped a circle on the emblem. The letters came clean in his hands. A make to break the heart of boys and collectors. A make that built cars like promises. He fished the flashlight from his jacket and pointed it inside through the clouded glass. The interior surprised him. Where the exterior wore centuries of weather in miniature, the seats still showed a dull sheen. Leather, not the cracked, flaking ruin he expected. Tight, glossy, dark as molasses. The dash was dusty but intact, the gauges a forest of chrome rings and needle-thin arrows. He frowned. Either someone had refurbished parts of this car in a later decade, or the garage had been both cruel and benevolent, leaking where it could do the most obvious harm, leaving untouched the place his hands had once cherished. He tried the door handle. It resisted, surrendered, and the smell intensified, an aroma like old books, and a faint, sweet musk. He sat. Kane leaned against the sill and put his hands on the wheel. It was big, the rim thin, and for a moment he was a boy again, smelling the interior of his father's Buick, feeling the grooved bite of the horn ring under his fingers, the sky out the windscreen too blue to be believed. He closed his eyes. Margaret had teased him about this, about how machines could turn him into a poem without his permission. He opened the glove compartment because it was there, because when the world offers you a small door you should see what room it opens into. Inside, the dim of the box, a packet of stiff documents, and a metal case the size of a paperback. It was gray and unadorned except for the triangular scuffs of long travels. He touched it the way one might touch a sleeping animal whose temperament is unknown. It came cold to his hand. The latch stuck at first, then flicked open with a noise that made the hair rise on his arms. He lifted the lid. Keys. 2 skeletal keys with leather fobs stamped in foil with the same proud emblem as the hood. Under them, folded thick paper, and a sheet with a seal. A bill of sale, hard with age. The letters written in a hand both careful and flamboyant. The signature a flourish. The name hummed recognition that skated his nerves. He whispered at once as if someone in the next room might hear and correct him. It was a star's name, an old Hollywood pharaoh whose jawline had sold movie tickets and wars, who had been photographed beside machines like this one, who had died alone in a cliffside house where the sea kept secrets for him. Arthur's vision swam. It wasn't money that made his throat tighten, though he was not immune to its practical miracles. It was witness. It was the fact of a life touching another life across time through the simplest of objects. A hand turning the same key, a shoulder settling under the same roof. It was Margaret's voice in his head. See, you never know what's waiting under the dust. He wanted to call to her, to tell her about the initials embossed on the leather, about the dealership name typed on the bill of sale, about the year that placed this car on the cusp of glamour. He lowered his head into his palms and the garage shifted out of focus as tears, stupid, grateful animal tears, broke and slid. He wiped his face with a sleeve and laughed once, a startled bark that bounced off the rafters. Okay, he said to the cars, to the ghosts, to the foolishness that suddenly felt like bravery. Okay. He checked the second car. The glove box was locked. He tried one of the keys from the case, not expecting anything. It turned. The compartment door creaked open to reveal a thinner envelope, brittle as phyllo. Inside, registration cards, an insurance certificate graced with the same famous name, a photograph, black and white, of a man in sunglasses with a hand on this very fender, half smile like he knew every secret in the county. Margaret would have whistled. Arthur felt the sensation of reality click into a new gear. He took out his phone, a cheap model with a camera generous enough to be decent. He took pictures, steady hands surprising him. He didn't post them anywhere. He didn't have anywhere to post them. He needed corroboration, not from comment sections, but from the world that counts signatures and seals. He stepped back and let the door swing shut gently as if he could bruise the past by carelessness. On the workbench under a plastic coffee can full of screws, he found a coil of invoices from a mechanic's shop in town, a place whose sign he'd driven past for 15 years without ever needing. The dates stopped abruptly in the early 70s. The notes bore a familiarity that implied a relationship with someone who had reason to keep secrets. There was a final note, penciled in the margin of a carburetor rebuild. Hold for pickup. Client out of the country. Beneath that, scribbled later, perhaps by the mechanic's son, perhaps by fate itself, client deceased. No heirs confirmed. Items stored until contacted. The ache in Arthur's back announced itself with a low, steady demand. He eased onto a stool and pressed the heel of his hand into a knot at his side. He would need help. Expert help. The kind that spoke in appraisals and followed paper trails to ugly conclusions and measured patina not as neglect, but as value. He did not know those men. He knew the VA pharmacist by first name and the nurse who used to double-knot Margaret's scarf. But the world of provenance and auctions and old money's attention was a world his wife had loved reading about in library books, and a world he had visited at the edges, shaking his head at the numbers and the discipline. He took the metal case, the documents, and the photograph. He placed them in a canvas bag he'd brought for trash. He locked the garage door with the same old lock because habit and superstition insisted, and then he drove into town, practicing the words he would say when he asked for an appointment with men who wore magnifying glasses like jewelry. Halfway down Ridge Road, he pulled to the shoulder. The fields opened around him to a pale distance. He placed both hands on the wheel and let himself breathe in counts. 4 in, hold, 6 out, the way the therapist had taught him. "We're okay," he told the truck, the road, his trembling left leg. "We're okay." A crow crossed the road ahead of him. Not the same one, but in the same office. He put the truck back into drive and went to find someone who could tell him whether the past he held in his bag was a currency the present would accept. The receptionist at Hargrave & Sons Appraisals had a haircut that looked like money knew her name. She glanced at Arthur's cane and at the canvas bag in his hand, her gaze switching gears from polite to cautious. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," he said, "but I've got something that may be worth your time. And mine." Her eyes softened at the quip, a veteran's tiny habit of leavening fear with borrowed wit, and she asked him to take a seat. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon oil and paper. Framed photographs lined the walls. Cars on concourse lawns. Cars at auction blocks beneath chandeliers. Cars being touched by men in gloves like they were breaking bread. Margaret would have walked slowly along that wall, reading the captions, not minding that her husband had already sat down, his patience like an old coat he could shrug off but always put back on. A man in a navy suit appeared. He had the careful tan of a winter golfer. "I'm Tom Hargrave," he said, offering a hand with the confidence of someone who'd clasped many hopeful hands and passed judgment with the same one. "How can we help, Mr. Williams?" Arthur said. "Arthur Williams." He set the bag on his lap. "I bought a farmhouse at auction. $300. Found 2 cars in the garage under tarps, both in rough shape. But inside," he paused. How to say it without sounding like a fairy tale. "I found papers. Keys. A bill of sale in the name of—" He said the name quietly enough that the receptionist could not catch it, loudly enough that the room itself would not let him be imprecise. Hargrave did not laugh. His eyebrows rose, but the movement was constrained by years of poker faces. "May I see?" Arthur handed him the metal case first, then the folded papers, careful as a priest with the wafer. Hargrave carried them to a table by the window. He laid them out like a small, delicate crime scene. He put on glasses. He used his phone to magnify a seal, ran a fingertip along a signature without touching it. He made a small sound in his throat, the noise of a man both considering a fact and revising his immediate future. "These look interesting," Hargrave said. The word stretched into a bridge between caution and excitement. "Where is the property?" Arthur told him. Hargrave knew the mechanic on the invoices. "Old Walt," he said, his voice nodding with nostalgia. "He used to keep half the county's secrets. His son took over. He died last year." "Which would explain the auction," Arthur said. Hargrave nodded, thinking. "Mr. Williams, if you're amenable, I'd like to send 2 members of my team with you to the property today. We should document the cars in situ. We should also be very careful. There are legal lanes here, estates, abandoned property, potential claims. If this is what I think it is, you've got something extraordinary. Not just in market terms," he said, glancing at Arthur's cane and the tired set of his shoulders, "but also in human terms. The provenance is a story. Stories anchor value." The word story landed in Arthur like a bell strike. "Margaret." He swallowed. "Come on then," he said, "before the weather decides it wants to be winter." They drove in Hargrave's SUV. the seat warmers a small luxury that felt like being invited to sit at the adults' table. 2 associates sat in the back, one a woman with a camera and a notebook, the other a bearded man carrying a case of tools that looked less mechanical than ceremonial. They listened as Arthur told the sequence: the auction, the tarps, the glove box, the metal case. The woman asked good questions and wrote without fuss, steady as a nurse. At the farmhouse, Hargrave stood silent for a minute, surveying the angles, the slant of the roof, the way the weeds pressed against the foundation. "It's always like this," he said, half to himself. Glamour laid down in the humus, waiting for a pawn ticket. The garage accepted the newcomers with the sullen dignity of a dowager. The associates moved with choreographed care, photos from every angle, close-ups of the tar lines on the hood, the pattern of the water damage in the rafters. The bearded man, Peter, examined the frames, murmuring about integrity, about what might be saved and what would fall to dust if you looked at it wrong. Hargrave stood by the coupe and exhaled through his nose. "It's real," he said. "That's the thing. It's real." The woman, Nina, opened the door with the same respect Arthur had shown. She photographed the seats and raised her eyebrows at their survival. "The leak path is here," she said, pointing to the line where water had favored a beam and spared the interior. "Luck has a plumber." She took a paint depth reading from a chipped section, nodded. "Original finish under the dust." They found the photograph again, placed it beside the headlight, recreated the angle, and compared. The curve of the fender was a signature only time rewrites. The match was exact enough to make Hargrave's poise slip for a second. "Well," he said softly, "for once the rumor mill underestimates." Arthur felt like a man at his own birthday party, hearing his name spoken with care by strangers who had decided he mattered. The emotion caught him off guard. He busied himself coiling an extension cord that had been stiff since the Ford administration. He listened to Peter estimate in gentle euphemisms: considerable rust bloom, structural attention required, a survivor that can be stabilized. He listened to Nina speak in terms of narrative, the star's final years. This county as a refuge or a hiding place. No registered heirs. The estate a maze of trusts that went quiet. Hargrave finally turned to Arthur with hands in his pockets like a man negotiating with a tide. "Mr. Williams, my counsel is this. We prepare a preliminary report, we make discreet inquiries about the estate, we secure the site as best we can in the meantime. Don't advertise. Don't let the story outrun the facts. If, as seems likely, there's no legal impediment, we can advise on sale, private, probably, to a collector who'll be kind. The market for these has gone mad in recent years. Even as is, a serious buyer will know what he's looking at." "How mad?" Arthur asked, not trusting his voice but granting it the dignity of the question. Hargrave named a range that made Arthur's breath pause. He said it as one might say a temperature, factual, not eager. Arthur's mind raced through ledgers, hospital bills with their bent knees of numbers, prescription bottles with long names and small reliefs, nights where sleep stood at the foot of the bed and refused to climb in. He thought not of yachts or trips, but of breathing without the strap of fear around the chest. "There's a second car," Nina said, eyes bright, camera clicking like a little hymn. "Not as famous a model, but under the same name," Arthur finished for her. "And perhaps part of the same story." Hargrave nodded. If they were parked here and forgotten, it likely wasn't malice. It was life. Things slip. People assume someone else holds the keys. He glanced at Arthur's cane and maybe at the place where grief sat like a careful animal at his side. And then a man with reasons of his own comes along and opens a door. News in a small county doesn't spread. It dilates. One careful phone call becomes 3, becomes a rumor that puts on a suit and knocks. Hargrave kept his counsel, but Hargrave's counsel had a brother-in-law with a bar, and the bar had a regular who mowed lawns along Ridge Road, and the regular had seen a black SUV with city plates parked at the old farmhouse long enough to make a story out of it. By the end of the week, 2 different men had knocked on Arthur's rental door with business cards that said, "Consultant," in fonts that apologized for themselves. He said no to both. He kept saying no. He kept driving out to the farmhouse in the mornings to sweep and breathe and listen. He didn't touch the cars more than necessary. He checked the locks twice, then a third time, and left a cheap radio playing inside the house because voices can confuse thieves. He took photographs of little things that made a life. The way paw prints came and went on the dusty porch, the light pooling on the kitchen floorboards at noon, a scrap of wallpaper where a child had practiced writing the alphabet in pencil C, D, E before getting bored and drawing a rocket. His body betrayed him intermittently, knees flaring, a weakness in his left hand like it forgot for a second that it belonged to him. He paced himself the way he had learned to pace the mind's dark weather. Work, rest, be kind to the hour you're in. At night he read. He read about the star whose name hummed through his new life, his films, his houses, his scandals faint now like the perfume of paper. He read about the models in his garage, their engineering, their foibles, the way collectors spoke of them like family members who drank too much but were never boring. He read about estate law until the sentences felt like someone else's bad dream. Hargrave, true to his word, moved everything along with the patience of a man who has done this dance enough times to know the steps and the places you must insert grace. The call came on a Wednesday that smelled like rain. "We're clear," Hargrave said, his voice edged with a pleasure he tried to keep professional. "The estate dissolved without heirs. The county holds title to the property, which you purchased in good faith. The contents were unclaimed and have passed by operation of law. Mr. Williams, they're yours." He sat on the edge of the bed, the cheap mattress moaning under him. He looked at Margaret's picture on the dresser, a Kodak moment from the 70s, her hair in a scarf, her smile a dare to the world to be less dull. "We did it," he said to her, because "you did it" felt like a betrayal. The dead do not need credit, only company. He ended the call and let himself fall back and stare at the ceiling, where a water stain looked like a map of a country no one had discovered yet. Hargrave proposed a private sale with the cars remaining as they were, an honest missive from time, plus the documents, the photograph, the story. He had 3 potential buyers, each with a reputation for paying and for leaving sellers with their dignity. Arthur asked, "Will they be restored?" Hargrave said, "One will stabilize them and leave the rest as testament. Another will bring them back for show. The third will warehouse them and call it love." Arthur chose the first buyer because the description made him think of someone who could sit in a quiet room and not turn on the TV. They met at the farmhouse. The buyer, Mr. Levin, was younger than Arthur had expected, 50 maybe, built narrow like a distance runner. He wore a sweater so soft it looked invented. He stood in the garage with his hands in his pockets, chin lifted slightly like he was listening for a distant train. "I knew him, you know," Levin said, meaning the star. "Met him at a party when I was 12. He asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I told him, old." He laughed and said, "Choose something else." "And did you?" Arthur asked. Levin considered. "I chose careful," he said. He turned to Arthur, and the humor slipped and sincerity took its place. "Sir, I can't repay the universe for this, but I can honor it. I'll pay what Tom says is fair. I'll do right by what's here. If you're amenable, I'll keep your name with the story when it's told." Arthur nodded. "Keep my wife's too," he said. Levin tilted his head, respectful. "Of course." The number slid across the table in Hargrave's office the next day on a piece of paper, in an envelope like something out of a spy film. Arthur looked at it and felt, not giddy, not greedy, simply unburdened. A man with a sore back set down a sack. A soldier let the pack slide and heard it thump into the dust of a road that finally grew kinder. "I accept," he said, and the room changed temperature by a few degrees, warmer by money's invisible weather. There were forms. There were signatures written slowly by a hand that had spent more time holding a rifle and a wife's fingers than a fountain pen. There were wires of funds that became numbers in accounts that would pay for procedures and pills and calendars without red circles around dates that meant fear. Hargrave shook his hand and gripped the forearm, an old-fashioned gesture that said brother without presuming the word. Levin hugged him, sudden and brief, the way a man hugs another man when both are startled by their own good luck and the way it braided them. The night before the cars were scheduled to be transported, Arthur went to the farmhouse alone. He sat on a milk crate between the couched beasts and spoke aloud, because why not? "I don't know what you did here," he told the cars and the ghost of the man who had been their first steward. "Hid from fame, or ran toward quiet. I can't say. But you were here and then I was here, and Margaret would say that's the wonderful arithmetic of the world, the way stray numbers find each other and decide to add." He reached up and touched the leather of the coupe's seat through the open door. His fingers came away faintly scented, a smell like old citrus and thyme. He thought of riding shotgun in a parade of years with Margaret beside him, pointing out small beauties. A red kite snagged in a cottonwood, a tire swing still moving, though no child had pushed it for hours, the way crows hold court. He thought of the man in the photograph, the secret in his half-smile, the life that had ricocheted through parties and broke itself on cliffs. He thought how luck, when it comes late, arrives like a letter you were sure had been lost. He cried then. Not a hurricane, a steady rain. It had been a long season. The garage heard him and said nothing. It kept its watch, the way places do when they have witnessed enough to know not to interrupt. Levin's truck came at dawn, a white rig with a gentle crew whose boots made careful sounds. They swaddled the cars with the love men give to machinery that has earned it. Nina came to take a last set of photographs. Hargrave shook hands and made small jokes that released the tension from everyone's shoulders. Arthur signed the final release and watched as the winch sang a low song, as the coupe rolled and creaked and climbed into the light. For a second the car looked regal again, not because it had been polished but because it was on the move, fulfilling its vocation, to carry. The second car followed, solemn, brave, and then the truck's door latched with a forgiving thunk. When the dust settled, the garage felt bigger and stranger, like a mouth without teeth. Light slanted across the floor, warming the stains into a palette of ochres and grays. Arthur stood in the middle and turned slowly, taking in the emptiness, as if he might catch in the corner of his eye the afterimage of what had been. He surprised himself. The emptiness did not feel like loss. It felt like proof. Something had happened. It would go on happening in other places now, in a shop where Levin's men would coax back function, in a museum where a plaque would mention the late-night garage, and the veteran with the cane, and the wife who loved auctions. He walked the house one more time before leaving. In the kitchen, he set a photograph of Margaret on the windowsill facing the yard, not as a shrine, just as a placeholder for what her eyes would have found. He found a pencil in a drawer and wrote a note on the back. We kept our promise. He left it there. The county would send someone to board things properly. The land would decide what it wanted to be next. Not his to say. His job had been to arrive and listen and open a small door. At the hospital the following week, he handed a woman with kind eyes and a badge the card of a billing department contact. We're paid, he said. The woman blinked. All of it? He nodded. She looked like someone had told her a trick about time. I'll make the calls, she said, and squeezed his hand. He paid the landlord 3 months ahead, then 6. He bought a new set of tires for the truck and a proper winter coat that didn't pretend thinness was virtue. He gave a quiet amount to the VFW hall that kept the heat on for men who pretended they weren't cold. He went to a lawyer and made a will gentle enough to carry what he now had, and practical enough to spare the living the uglier puzzles. He planted daffodil bulbs in small pots in his kitchen, because Margaret had taught him that forcing bulbs in winter was a way to conspire with spring. The day the first green spear broke the soil, he drove back to the farmhouse just to sit on the porch steps. The wind felt cleaner. The sky had switched to a blue he trusted. He thought, briefly, guiltily, about buying the place, restoring it. He could, but he knew the truth in his bones. The house had served its purpose. It had been the stage, the witness, the mailbox where a letter addressed to him was held without malice until he arrived. Keeping it would be sentimentality of a kind that did not honor the story. He could love it from the road, wave at it in his heart, let it belong to someone else's next chapter. As he sat, a boy on a bicycle skidded to a stop in the gravel by the gate. He was maybe 10, with a baseball cap too big and that fearless curiosity of childhood that asks without worrying about dignity. "Hey, mister," the boy said. "Is that your house?" "It was mine for a minute," Arthur said. "My granddad says there was movie stuff in the garage. Like treasure." "There was history," Arthur said. "Treasure's just what you call history before you understand it." The boy nodded as if he'd been expecting that answer from the world all along. "You a soldier?" he asked, pointing at the cane. "I was," Arthur said. "Still am, some days." "My granddad was in Nam," the boy said. "He don't talk much, but he likes when I listen." "That's a good trick," Arthur said. "Listening." He reached into his coat pocket and took out one of the keys. Not to the cars. They belonged elsewhere now. This was to the garage lock, heavy and lower than the belly button of the world. He put it on the porch between them. "You keep that," he said. "Not to use, just to remember that door's open." The boy took the key in both hands like it might hum. "Thanks," he said, suddenly shy. He pedaled away, zigzagging between ruts, and the key flashed once in the sun like a small, bright fish. Arthur stood, the motion slow but easy. He looked once more at the garage and the leaning mailbox and the line of the roof against the kind sky. "Thank you," he said. To the house, to the cars, to the idea that the world sometimes hides kindness in places you almost don't go. He walked to his truck, set the cane across his lap before he closed the door, and turned the key. On the radio, a jazz station gave him a trumpet that sounded like forgiveness. He drove toward town, toward an afternoon without fear of the mailbox, without the arithmetic of dread. He wasn't cured, of grief, of pain, of the nights when the dark knocked and insisted, but he was solvent in a precious way. He could attend to his body without bargaining with his future. He could sit in his kitchen and watch daffodils suggest a season. He could tell Margaret a new story when he visited the cemetery on Sundays. He could say, "We took a long shot and it landed." And sometimes when the light came just so through the blinds and turned the dust into a quiet cathedral, he would close his eyes and see the garage again as it had been that first hour. The tarps rising like breath, the chrome blinking through the gray, the old world sitting there with its lost composure. He would feel again the weight of the metal case in his hand, the click of the latch, the whisper of paper naming a man whose face once sold dreams. He would hear his own voice saying, "Okay," and he would know that the life he had left would be enough, not because it was large, but because it rang true. Some stories end with a man driving into the sunset, the screen going gold and wide. Arthur's ended smaller and better. It ended with a man driving to the pharmacy with the right card in his wallet, with the heat working, with the knowledge that somewhere, in a shop smelling of solvent and patience, a pair of cars were being coaxed back into the world by careful hands. It ended with a key changing pockets and with a boy pedaling away, and with the wind running its hand over a field that had watched men try and sometimes be tried, and with a house that, emptied of its secret, could finally rest. It ended, which is to say it turned, which is to say it began again.